This is an interview with Robertjohn Gillespie on November 7th at his home over near Mars Hill. And Robertjohn, tell us how you got into climbing in the first place.
I found a book in the college library at Western Carolina. And I don't know what I was looking for at the time, but it certainly wasn't a book about climbing. And I just picked this book up. It turned out to be a book called Modern Mountaineering. And it was by George Allen Smith, I think was the person who wrote it. And it was largely sort of a beginning text for people going to the Alps, I think. It was very slanted toward alpine kind of climbing. And I thought, man, this looks like fun. And the best I could judge from the pictures, they used a rope for something, and these little nails that they drive into the wall, how they get those to go into the rock like that, that's a puzzlement. So based on the invitation that book extended, I thought, okay, I finally got the idea that you do it usually with another person, and that the rope is basically there to catch you if you fall off the rock. And having no idea that you could buy this kind of equipment, I made some pitons probably out of sheet metal, just something just absolutely weak. Wow. But it looked right. It looked like the same thing that George Allen Smith was using. And he had an ice axe. And although there weren't any big ice fields in North Carolina, I'm thinking, well, you need an ice axe anyhow, because sometimes the brush scrambling is real steep and you never know when you might need to chop into a roto root and pull yourself up. So I found a little a World War II Army surplus pick that was small enough that you could put it in a rucksack to dig a foxhole with or something. And I cut it down a little bit in size so that it looked more like what George Allen Smith had. And found a rope, probably in my dad's basement, probably polypropylene. That was it. That was and a ball peen hammer.
Wow.
And that was it. And
what
so
year
the
was
only
that?
thing.
How old were you?
I had just transferred over to Western Carolina. That was in 1962. So the only other thing I could see that was lacking for me to become a real climber was to find some other person who also wanted to do this. And I went through a succession of partners. They each went with me one time. And we would go up toward Glenville and Cashers from Cullowhee. And there were various little cliffs around the area that looked plenty big to me. These things are 50 feet tall, man. So we started climbing there, and why we didn't die, I have no idea. But there was one partner, his name was a fellow from Hendersonville who was at school there, and he got really scared part way up. I shouldn't even tell this about him. I'll do it because we'll leave the name anonymous, okay? He was starting up the pitch that I had led, I guess, and he stopped, and I heard him down there praying. And he was saying, "Dear God, if you'll get me out of this alive, I'll never do it again."
Sounds like me.
Wow. I think he was also given to some risky sports. Later on, he wanted to learn how to be a quick draw artist. Get a revolver out of the holster and fire it real quick. He shot himself in the leg trying to get his revolver out of the holster. So if it hadn't been climbing, it would have been something else for him.
Yeah. Good thing he didn't bring the gun that day.
Yeah. A little more of the story is that in 1964, I went to Yellowstone Park to work as a summer employee at Yellowstone Park service stations, and met my lifetime friend Calvin Alexander, who worked at the same station that I worked at, and he had also seen those Grand Tetons as he came into Yellowstone Park. And he also had been exposed just enough to climbing to know that he wanted to try this. And consequently, we teamed up and arranged to have our same day off each week. And we would invariably go from Canyon Village in Yellowstone down to the Tetons and spend a long day off, like Friday night, camp Friday night, climb all day Saturday, camp Saturday night, and then get back to work by Sunday afternoon.
Man.
And in the process of doing that, we realized that there's a whole culture of people who climb. There are people who are world renowned who live right here in Jackson, Wyoming. And we became acquaintances with Barry Corbett, who had just returned from Mount Everest and had done a number of big first ascents in the Grand Tetons with his friend Jake Breitenbach, who died in Nepal on the Everest climb.
The 63 American Everest expedition?
Yes, that was it. And Barry realized that we didn't know what the hell we were doing much, and so he steered us into some climbs that would be good climbs to learn how to just do some basic stuff, like climb up a steep snowfield without coming off of it, and how to use a little bit of piton protection for the rope, and not feel that we were going to die in the process. So eventually we spent the summer climbing, and both of us returned to Yellowstone the next summer, 1965, and continued. And by the end of '65, we did some things like the Johnson Ridge over at Cemetery Spire. Did the Durance Ridge a number of times just because it was such a pleasurable climb. And a bunch of other stuff in the range, a lot of it on Cemetery Spire, because we could get over there in a day and climb and get back to the boat in time to get back home.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
but that's how I got started. And when I came here back home after that summer of '65, I guess, I went back to work for my father in his service station for a little bit in Hendersonville. And Bob Watts came in, and Bob and I had become friends somewhere along the line. And we realized that we both had an interest in climbing, which we had not realized before, because our friendship was based on other stuff. And Bob introduced me to Steve Longnecker, because the two of them worked at Camp Mondamin down at Tuxedo, and they were starting some kind of a introduction to ropes or introduction to rappelling or something of that nature for the camp. And the three of us, we liked each other, and we said things like, "You ever been over to Looking Glass Rock?" "Well, no, but I've seen it. Why don't we go over there and see what we can find?" And that began our explorations of Looking Glass, and eventually around the Linville Gorge area.
What was the feeling like of pioneering those new areas, especially Linville Gorge?
I don't think we had much of a sense of pioneering, although we may have been doing that. I think for us it was, gosh, this is fun. Let's find another one and do it. I don't know that we ever had this sense that we're paving the way, for something to come later. It just never got through. As they say now. I didn't know break my glasses.
What were the first things you guys explored when you went to Linville Gorge?
The side over where Wiseman's View is. And we looked across at Table Rock, and it was a while before we ever went over there.
Really?
There were some short things at Wiseman's View that we climbed on, and we didn't have the concept of line, of a climb as being an entity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's got a bottom, a beginning, and a line and an end.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't much in our thoughts, I think, early on. I think it was more like, here's a place we can get up. You know,
Yeah.
we can manage this, we can climb it and get up there to that ledge. And so a lot of our climbing was scampering that gave way to scrambling that gave way to, I think we need a belay here, you know, to that sort of thing.
Right.
And only later did we start having any idea that we could start down here and climb right here and end up there, and we will have done a climb. That came later.
Right. So you were at Wiseman's View first?
Yeah, right around there. Probably the first several times that we went over to the Linville Gorge area, we went to Wiseman's View. And then we started going to Table Rock.
Uh-huh.
And by that time, the Outward Bound School, I think, was already a presence there. And we learned that there had been climbing up on Table Rock. Not much, maybe, but some. And actually, Mike, I don't know that Steve and Bob Watts and I ever went much to Table Rock.
Mm-hmm.
I think by the time I started going to Table Rock, Bob Watts had already pretty much stopped climbing. And Steve and I, most of our efforts together were at Looking Glass.
Right.
And by the time I started going over to Table Rock, Steve and I were getting near the end of our climbing life together. So we didn't really do much over there. You're aware that he took a hell of a fall in 1972.
What happened?
We were climbing a route that was a pretty good route as you go down through the Devil's Kitchen or the Devil's Cellar, and you get down to the bottom of it and you start this trail that goes clockwise around Table Rock. Well, just about the time you start that trail out of the Devil's Cellar, we started a climb right there. And Steve had done the first pitch. He and Bob Watts and I. Steve had done the first pitch, and he was up about 70 feet, and he took a fall. He fell a lot. Steve was a rough climber. He would throw him. You're not going to tell Steve this, are you? He might kick my butt. He was rough. It was like, attack. I'll get it. Okay, I fell off. I'll get it again. And he fell off again. I'll try it again. And he would literally beat his head against the rock. The roughest climber I've ever seen. He often got up, but it's such an expenditure of energy. But anyhow, he was up about 70 feet and he fell. And the piece of webbing that he had used to circle around his waist to make his loop, his belt, had been purchased from a roll of webbing at the store that when it got near the end, someone just taped it onto the new roll of webbing so that it could pull off the roll easily. Mm-hmm. And the tape had never been discovered. It had never been discovered that was two pieces of webbing there, not just a marker tape. Mm. Well, Steve was tied into that piece of webbing, and when he fell, the tape just pulled apart and dumped him, and he came all the way to the ground and landed right almost in Bob's lap. Mm. It would have killed Bob if he had been just 4 feet closer into the wall when he hit.
Yeah.
And he got a terrible concussion. He went to Duke Medical Center for a week. He remembered none of it, not being there. And it took him a long time to recover and get back to climbing. But in fairness to Steve, I would have to say that when he did go back to climbing, he was so smooth. Mm. It was as if he had lost that kind of an attitude, and he was he was smooth and liquid on his climbs, and it was really a pleasure to
Wow.
watch him climb. And it was too bad because we were sort of nearing the end of our time together, and we didn't climb much after that.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
I don't know if he maintained that smoothness or not,
Yeah.
because I didn't see much of him after that.
And how did you meet Bob Mitchell?
I met Bob Mitchell at Camp Sequoia. He had been hired as a counselor and to be the assistant to the person in the rock climbing program, the mountaineering program they called it. So when I got to Camp Sequoia, Steve Longnecker said, "Hi, this is Bob Mitchell. He's going to be working with you." Okay, Bob Mitchell, I'm glad to meet you. Call me Mitch. And turns out that he would like to climb, but he never had done any of it. And we just started hanging out together and doing some little climbs there at the camp with the boys who were there as campers. And Mitch started doing some of the things on his own. For instance, we had a 30 or 40 foot cliff that we would use as a top rope place. And we would let the boys, the campers, tie into the rope, and then we would belay from the top. And we thought it was pretty hard climb. We wouldn't want to do this without having a top rope on it. And the boys learned how to climb it. And one day Mitch went out there, and I don't think he even had a rope on. I think he just went up there by himself and just climbed the thing. And at that point I realized that we're dealing with something that's a little bit out of our mentality or out of our scope of what is possible. And I never had any other impression of Mitch in the years that we climbed together, except that he is almost in a different league than I am.
Wow.
And we did a lot of climbing. We climbed a lot of things and had some good first descents, and there were even times when maybe on Bumblebee Buttress, and I think I may have already told you this, but I'll say it again, that it was his turn to lead a pitch, and he said, Robertjohn, he said, "Bob, I'm not up to this. Would you mind leading it?" And I thought, good gracious, this is like Jesus asking if I'll walk on the water for him. And so we did the climb, and it was fine, but I always had just great admiration for his intrepidity. He wasn't scared by anything. He may be the only really fearless person I've ever met, or at least the only one I've ever given that label to. I honestly don't think the man was afraid of anything.
Wow.
He was respectful. He wasn't a reckless climber. He was a really good, solid rope mate. And I always enjoyed climbing with him. He took me on stuff that I wouldn't otherwise have tried, probably. But he was intrepid, and I have no doubt that he is that way to this day.
And what routes do you remember that you and Mitch did together?
Bumblebee Buttress,
Yeah.
by far the best one.
Yeah.
It was one of those golden days in the mountains. Everything was right. Everything was, thank you for letting us be alive on this rock today.
Yeah.
It was that kind of a deal.
And why did you guys name it Bumblebee?
At a ledge about maybe halfway up the wall, there's a pretty roomy ledge up there where you can sit and take off your shoes and, have lunch or whatever. And there was a laurel bush growing out of the crack in the rock up there, and it was covered in blossoms. And the day we went up there, it was just covered in bumblebees.
Wow.
They weren't honeybees, they were bumblebees. And they were on this bush, and you could just hear them there and see them there humming. And I think the name just sort of gave itself to the climb. What could we call this other than Bumblebee Buttress?
Yeah. What other ones did you guys do over at Table Rock?
The first thing we ever did together was North Ridge, which not exceedingly difficult, but it had a nice line. It was on a prominent place at the it was a ridge. It is a ridge where a couple of little faces come together. There was an obvious line to climb right up the middle of it, and it just appealed to us. And we, I think, maybe did that one before we did anything else together. That was one of the early ones. And again, if you look at the guidebook, I may be all wrong on this. Yeah. It may have been much later, but it seems like it was one of the first.
Okay. And another one that you did, do you remember Peekaboo?
Oh yeah, Peekaboo was a real fun one. I don't remember much about the pitches except the one where you're perched and you've got to make a certain commitment of stepping out there and hope that there's a good hole there. And then you can look around the wall and see the rest of the climb going on up there. Yeah. But it was a little bit daunting for us to step over there and make that, make the commitment that would enable us to see around the corner, hence the name Peekaboo. Yeah. And the exposure there was real great. If you fell off, you'd be splattered. So, I don't know how these climbs, I know that all of our climbs have been eclipsed so far in terms of difficulty. At the time, it seemed like it was just right for us. I don't know if anybody goes to Peekaboo nowadays or not.
Oh yeah,
they ought to.
Oh, it's very.
It's a fun climb.
No, all your routes are very popular. You did the classics: Bumblebee, North Ridge, Peekaboo. Mm-hmm. Talk about the time when Mitch first took you to the NC wall.
He told me that, Bob, you got to come and look at this. I found this place, and he took me down to the. And I don't know if I'm remembering my geography right here or not, but we went down to some place where we could look down and out to the right, and down there was this wall. And he said, "Look at that line right there. Doesn't that just call for us to go down there and climb it?" And we bushwhacked our way down to the foot of that cliff, and Bumblebee would have been the first thing that we did there.
Okay. Did y'all do anything else on the North Carolina wall? I can't remember.
I don't much think we did.
Okay. And then
I don't know how that term for that place came around, North Carolina wall. It always seemed a little bit pretentious to us.
Oh, I think
because in Yosemite there was a nose and there was a North America wall, and to name our climbs the nose and the NC wall, that seems a little bit hokey. But those names stuck for some reason.
Yeah.
I hope it wasn't because we helped them along, but they stuck.
And then you guys went to the amphitheater, maybe before or after Bumblebee. I can't remember.
I can't tell you. I don't know.
Doesn't matter.
I'm thinking it was before.
Okay. Let's talk about the amphitheater. Maybe the first time you went down there with Mitch?
No, it was with Keith Evans.
Okay.
Who was also a Camp Mundaman person. In fact, Keith and Brad Shaver and I operated a weekend climbing school in about 1972 or so, and we had like full weekends. Every weekend we would take a class of 8 or 12 people either over to Table Rock or over to the south side on Looking Glass, where there was a good ramp for our classroom purposes. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, Keith was one of the partners in that school, and he took me and Roy Davis and maybe Steve Longnecker. I don't know who all was there, but he took us down to the amphitheater, and at that time there was no trail there. It was just my recollection of it was that it was like kind of walking into a paradise of some sort. There was a cliff with moss and a waterfall coming down off of it, and at the bottom it was flat and grassy, and you could have built a house there and it would have been a wonderful place to have a house in the amphitheater. But we went there and marveled at what a beautiful place it was, and then I guess we kept on going on around to to other climbs, or to the prow maybe.
Yeah. And so maybe the first climb you did down there was the Mummy?
I think it was the Mummy. Yeah.
And who
And
was
when Mitch and I went down to do that, it was like, oh yeah, there's this beautiful amphitheater kind of a place. I don't know if we gave it that name or not. We may have, because of its, obvious amphitheater-ish
Yeah.
shape. But Mitch and I and maybe Steve went on down to do the Mummy later.
What do you recall about that day when you guys did the Mummy?
I can't
Nothing.
help you on that.
Tell us about was it the second ascent? Somebody did it nude?
Roy Davis and Brad Shaver and I, may have been the three of us. There could have been a fourth member.
Let's show that picture of Brad. Is it handy?
Yeah, it's right here.
Okay.
That was in 1976. That
Okay.
picture was mine.
And all right, we'll talk about Brad in a second. But you and Roy Davis and
Brad. And on the final pitch of the Mummy, Roy had he had led and had a belay ledge up top, and he wondered why Brad and I why one of us wasn't coming on up. And what we had done was take off our clothes. Brad and I took off all of our clothes except our boots and put our climbing ropes back onto us, and we both hooked in at the same point, like just 3 or 4 feet apart. We were both hooked into the rope there, and one of us did the talking. Like I would say, Roy, okay, up rope, we're coming up, climbing, and it took us we went a little slower because there were 2 of us banging into each other as we came up the rock, and we thought that this would be just so funny and that Roy would just find it hilarious, and you guys are such cut-ups. And we got up to within sight of Roy, and he just got so pissed off. He said, the 2 of you climbing together like that, if you had fallen, I couldn't have caught you. That was stupid, and he stayed mad about it for a while.
Wow.
Until he eventually got over it, I guess.
And so how about other things? We know the story of Looking Glass and the nose route. What else did you work on at Looking Glass? Maybe the Odyssey?
No, Brad and I climbed on the Odyssey. We did one pitch of it, and then Mitch and Art, I guess, very soon thereafter took up that project and took it all on through to the top.
Okay. Tell me, hold this up. Let's put this right here, and tell me what you remember about Brad.
Brad started coming to our house in Asheville about early 1970s. He was just out of school. Or maybe he wasn't even out of school. As I remember, Brad was I think maybe a little bit naive, and certainly just he hadn't made a lot of worldly experience yet, but he wanted to climb, and he had a natural ability as a climber. He was very good with his balance and his moves and his fluidity, and he started more or less hanging around with Roy Davis and Bob Thompson, who was also climbing with us then, and I. Maybe with Steve Longnecker a little bit, and eventually Brad figured out what was going on, and he started making climbs of his own. I think he did some hard climbs. I can't tell you what his record was. I don't know which climbs he did, but he was pretty good. He eventually went with a friend to the Himalaya to climb a peak whose name I cannot tell you, in northern India.
Danagiri.
Danagiri, that's it. And he did not come back. He was lost. He and his partner were lost, and no one knows for sure just what happened to him. Since Brad is no longer here to contest this, I'll tell you just a short little story about him that makes up one of my fond memories of Brad. He and I went to Looking Glass once together to climb. I think it became the Cornflake Crack, maybe, but at the time it had no name. And I had led the first pitch and had placed several pitons along the way, and Brad was on the ground belaying. And I fell off, and my first piton popped out. And then I got down, and the next piton down popped out, and I was unzipping and falling very rapidly down to where Brad was when a piton held. And the sponge, the stretchiness of the rope, when I hit the end of the rope, let me go like, boom, and every time I would go down to Brad's level and look him in the eye, and then I would be jerked back up by the elasticity in the rope, and then I would come down again, and there's Brad, and he was wide-eyed and like, what happened? And he had gone to sleep while I was up there climbing, and it was only the noise of me falling off the rock and unzipping that waked him up. And just at the last second, he clamped down on the rope just in time to see me come down in front of his face.
Oh my gosh.
If he hadn't woke up when he did, I would have just smattered right into the rock.
Yeah.
But since it all ended well, they say all's well that ends well. And this ended well, and we laughed at it later.
When did you start easing out of the climbing scene?
1981. My friends and I went to the Grand Tetons and did the Cathedral Traverse together.
Which consists of?
Tiwanaut, Mount Owen, and the North Ridge of the Grand. And it was so satisfying to us and to me that I think it kind of sated me. It was pretty much a good culmination for what I thought was a pretty long climbing career, and I did not burn to climb after that. I shifted my interest to other things.
Wow.
Flying primarily, but climbed a little bit, just some things by myself when we would go to Wyoming for the summer or for part of the summer. I would excuse myself and go out and climb for a day, just scrambling some things. But no more roped partnering until Mike Fishesher showed up in 2017 and invited me to come over to Looking Glass and top rope a piece with him.
So you went to the Tetons from 64 to 81 every summer?
Not every, but
almost.
A bunch of them.
Wow. Show us the ice axe that you used all those years.
Okay. My beloved ice axe that Barry Corbett sold me in 1964. It's a wooden shaft. I don't know what kind of wood. It's a big heavy clunker thing that's long enough that you can use it as a cane if you want to just have a walking stick. It's especially good on real steep snowfields. If you take a fall, you can just kind of stick this thing under your armpit and just bear down on it like this into the hard-packed snow, and you'll stop real quick. For belaying, you can pound it down into the snow until just the head sticks out and wrap a little piece of webbing around the top so that it won't slide down the shaft. And you can use that to belay if you don't put too much sudden load on it. but a real sudden load on it will break the shaft off, and there goes your climbing partner. It's got a little reinforcer that comes down front and back, so that gives the head a little bit of extra strength, but it will break off right there. I've seen some broken ones.
So you used that axe from the time Barry Corbett sold it to you.
I would use it right now if I went back out to the Tetons to do a little, to send some snowfields. I'd take this axe with me.
It's a great,
because it does the job perfectly.
Great axe
for what I want it to do.
Yeah.
But it was built in Austria. I can't make out the name. There's a little bit of rust on there. But it was sold by Jerry, which used to be a mountain climbing shop in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah. They had a mail order service, and you could. Mm-hmm. This came from Jerry to Barry Corbett's shop. Jerry supplied Barry Corbett's shop with certain things, certain mountaineering items, because Jerry could import them, and I guess Barry couldn't. I don't know how that worked out, but that's where they came from.
And then how about the old Teton that you found on the north face of the Grand Teton?
Yeah, this is my only real collector's item as my climbing paraphernalia. This is a piece of spring steel that came off of the springs of an automobile, probably a T model or something like that. And it's cut off the end of the sheath, the shackle of spring, the leaf of spring, tapers from about 1/8 of an inch down to nothing out here at this end. And it's got a hole drilled in it. And this I found on the north face of the Grand Teton, early 1970s. And I showed it to someone at the climbing ranger station, and they said, "Oh, that's one of Paul Pedzalt's original leaf spring pitons." And the best they could date it was about 1935, or maybe even a little earlier. And I think I'm going to see if anybody out there in a museum might like to have it. I don't climb with it anymore. But it's a perfectly good piton. It's strong steel, got a good hole in it, taper on the end. But that's a collector's item. These have been written about in the Teton guidebook. Like Paul Pedzalt he made his own pitons out of leaf spring steel.
Wow.
This is one of them. My pitons were not so elegant. This is going back now to that 1964 guidebook that I read about George Allen Smith. Not a guidebook, but instructional book. And he had some pitons, so I figured if he can make them, I can too. His had little teeth on them, so I figured I better put teeth on mine. This may be part of a piece of aluminum pie plate or something. I don't know what it is, but it's pretty flimsy. But during those early days of going up to Cashers from Western Carolina, this is what we used. We had a half dozen of these things, and we never took a big fall on them, as you can imagine. But they worked okay for what we asked them to do. And our carabiners consisted of nice steel pieces like this that are, 15 pounds each or so, and pieces like this. This was the first carabiner I ever used, and it's hell, I can't even get it open now. Well, just take my word for it that it opens up. It's made to link two logging chains together. And if you open it up and put a rope in it and then snap it all back shut, you've got a real live carabiner. Kind of heavy. You could pull a bulldozer out of the mud with this thing. But, at the time we had to improvise. We didn't know there was a climbing shop anywhere, so we made our own stuff. And this clothesline, it'll hold a heavy load of wash when you hang it out, so it ought to hold us too. Nobody's going to believe this stuff. They're going to say, that guy's lying. Clothesline, indeed.
What advice do you have for the modern day climbers from the experience you had?
This is going to sound. This almost sounds hokey. It's so obvious. You're climbing today. One of these days you're not going to be. Take it in and enjoy it and have a good time. It's not going to last forever, believe me.